Elizabeth Warren, as you know, is a hardcore liberal leftist, and she's extremely vicious and mean-spirited in her attacks against conservatives, and it's like, okay, fine. Well, Elizabeth Warren decided to get up there and smear Jeff Sessions from the floor of the Senate as some kind of a racist. Now, here's the problem. Senate rules clearly state that senators are not allowed, to stand up there on the Senate floor and impugn the integrity or motives, or in other words, personally attack and personally insult and impugn the integrity and reputation of fellow senators. They're allowed to debate the issues, but they're not allowed to personally smear their colleagues. These are the Senate rules. Because in the United States Senate, the rules are, and these rules have been in place for years, folks. The rules have clearly been, we need to show professionalism and professional courtesy and protocol, and so not launch into personal smear attacks here in the floor of the Senate. Well, Elizabeth Warren, being the good liberal that she is, decided, I don't care what the rules are, I'm going to violate the rules anyway. I'm going to break the rules anyway. And she gets up there and she starts tearing into Jeff Sessions personally, suggesting that he's a racist. But what she tried to do was do it in a sneaky way. Rather than her saying, this is my opinion, she dug up an old letter from Coretta Scott King from decades ago. This was back, I think, in the 1980s, if I remember right. Coretta Scott King, the widow of the late Dr. Martin Luther King. And this was back when Jeff Sessions was being nominated for a judgeship, or was it? I think it was a U.S. attorney back then. But anyway, Coretta Scott King was opposed to Jeff Sessions. She has bought into the Jeff Sessions is a racist kind of belief that she had back then. So she wrote this letter back then, laying out this case of why she personally believes he's a racist and he's against black people, and he's just a bunch of really ugly things, that he's intimidated and chilled the free exercise of voting for black citizens, that he gave a shabby attempt to intimidate and frighten elderly black voters, that he has, quote, reprehensible conduct, that he has, quote, hostility to the rights of black people, stuff like that. It's just a bunch of ugly things that Coretta Scott King wrote in this letter back in the 1980s. So Elizabeth Warren decided, oh, it's not me saying it. I'm just going to read what the widow of Martin Luther King had to say. Well, no, you're not allowed to do that because you're still smearing. So it's like if a Republican senator got up there and wanted to smear a fellow senator, smear a Democrat senator, and accuse him of being a racist or a bigot or a hate monger or anything else. Like, oh, I'm not going to give you my opinion. I'm just going to read the opinion of someone else, and then pick some prominent, respected conservative who said a bunch of nasty smear things against them. You can't do stuff like that. It's a violation of the rules. Senator Warren knows it's a violation of the rules. But she didn't care. She's going to ignore the rules. Now, let me stress, first of all, I understand that here's what they're saying on the left right now. Oh my goodness, those Republicans, they're all about censorship. They wouldn't even give her a chance to speak. And somebody like Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's widow, her words are not even allowed to be spoken in the United States Senate. That's what Elizabeth Warren is saying. Oh, somebody like Coretta Scott King, her words don't even qualify to be allowed to be spoken in the Senate. That's so dishonest. That's a blatant lie. Republicans have no problem whatsoever with Coretta Scott King or anyone else's words being spoken in the Senate. What they do have a problem with is specifically using certain words that impugn the integrity and a violation of Senate rules against a colleague. You're not allowed to do that. Now, look, I understand Coretta Scott King is the widow of Dr. Martin Luther King. All right, Martin Luther King, of course, was killed in 1968. Coretta Scott King, just like Jesse Jackson, just like Al Sharpton, many people who were there with Dr. King in his struggles, what's happened is they've really gone, many of them, hardcore left-wing. And Coretta Scott King has done this too. She's become hardcore liberal left-wing Democrat, smearing Republicans as racists. This is unfortunately the belief that Coretta Scott King has developed about Republicans and conservatives. That's unfortunate. But we can't, folks, we cannot get to a place in this country where just because you're a civil rights icon, you can never be wrong. You can never be challenged. We went through this with John Lewis, didn't we? Civil rights icon John Lewis, when he said that Donald Trump is not a, quote, legitimate president. Donald Trump fired back at John Lewis, and what did we hear? Oh, this is so wrong. How dare anybody besmirch the legacy of John Lewis? It's like, no, just because it's a civil rights icon doesn't mean he's right about everything. There are things he can be wrong about. Just because Coretta Scott King is the grieved widow of Dr. Martin Luther King doesn't mean that decades after her husband's assassination that she can't be wrong about some things. And she was wrong about her claim that Jeff Sessions was a racist. Now, liberals are going to say she's right about that because liberals tend to accuse conservatives of being racist no matter what. Okay, fine. But you can't take her letter and now use that as an excuse to violate the rules. Elizabeth Warren was doing this. So what happened is in the hearings themselves as they were going on, you had the presiding senator over the hearings basically stop her and say, you know, you can't do this. This is Senator Steve Daines. He said, quote, he interrupted her saying, the senator is reminded that it is a violation of Rule 19 of the standing rules of the Senate to impugn another senator or senators any conduct or motive unworthy or unbecoming a senator. And Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren, she tried to claim ignorance and innocence. She said, I don't think I quite understand. I'm simply reading what she wrote. I'm just reading what... You know, and Senator Daines, presiding chairman, he's like, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to impugn a fellow senator from the floor. These are clearly the rules of the Senate. She didn't care. She did it anyway. So finally, Mitch McConnell, who's the leader of the leader of the Senate itself, is a Republican. He got up there. He's in charge of the Senate. He's Senate Majority Leader. And he then interrupted her and said, you know what, that's it. That's it. You need to sit down. Now, she was allowed to go on for over 20 minutes until finally Republicans said, you know what, enough is enough. We're not going to allow you to continue to violate the rules in this way when you know full well these are the rules. And you don't get to hide behind, well, yeah, but I'm reading what somebody else wrote. And then it's Coretta Scott King, the widow of Martin Luther King. So now you can paint the picture that here's Republicans shutting down and silencing and censoring the widow of Martin Luther King. Do you see how dirty and sleazy and dishonest these liberal Democrats are in Washington? How dirty of politics that they play? This is the reason why, folks. There's a lot of Republicans that look to Donald Trump and say, hey, you know what? We're cheering you on that you take off the gloves and you know how to bare-knuckle fight. It's just so wrong for her to have done this. It is. But she was shut down, and I'm glad she was shut down. It was the right thing to do. And I want to remind everybody here, those of you that are convinced that Jeff Sessions really is some kind of racist that Coretta Scott King claims that he was back in the 1980s, Jeff Sessions has an actual track record of doing just the opposite. As a U.S. attorney, he filed several cases to desegregate schools in Alabama. Do you know that? He was leading the effort to desegregate schools in Alabama. He also prosecuted a Klansman for killing a black teenager. And on top of that, Sessions insisted, as the Attorney General of Alabama, that the death penalty had to come for this Klansman. There hadn't been a white man executed for killing a black man in Alabama since 1913. That's how unheard of it was. And Jeff Sessions demanded and insisted, no, I want him executed for killing that black teenager. And he followed through with this. Jeff Sessions in his successful prosecution of the KKK in California or in Alabama, ended up bringing them to their financial knees and ultimately destroying them and bankrupting them in Alabama. Did you know that? But that's because of Jeff Sessions' efforts to bring lawsuit after lawsuit against the KKK.